The flames curled upward, licking at the night sky like the claws of a beast, devouring the remnants of a life inside. Amid the roar of the fire, the shrill shrieks of the sirens had all but faded, swallowed by the growing inferno. The fire truck's lights painted the street in frantic, dizzying flashes of red and blue, a stark contrast to the night that had been too calm just hours ago. Inside the building, there was only one figure that refused to move. His coat, a deep mix of browns and blacks, was barely visible through the smoke, but his posture was unwavering, shoulders taut, ears pinned forward in perfect alertness. His name was Ghost, and he wasn't leaving. Firefighters silhouetted against the flames shouted at him, "Get out, boy! Get out of there now!" But Ghost didn't budge. His eyes, so dark and resolute, stayed focused on the doorway where the heat from the flames warred with the cold, heavy air of the outside world. He was standing guard, as if the fire was nothing compared to the duty etched into his bones. The wind howled, scattering embers into the street as a new wave of flames surged toward him. A firefighter, hands shaking with the force of adrenaline, reached for his radio. "Command, we've got a K-9 still in the building. Someone needs to go in and..." Before he could finish the sentence, another firefighter shouted from the side, his voice trembling. "He's not leaving the door, not even for us. He's protecting someone. We need to find out who." The team hesitated, eyes flickering to the inferno. But there was no time to question it. No time to wonder why this dog, the soldier of duty, was standing where no living creature should be, guarding against the flames with a fierceness that only a few could comprehend. The fire chief, a woman named Lara, stepped forward, the heat hitting her face like a slap. "Get me in there," she barked. "I'll take the risk." Her team protested. "Lara, it's too dangerous. The building's going to collapse any minute." But Lara's gaze flicked to Ghost, to the way his stance held firm, his eyes never wavering from the doorway. Her gut twisted in recognition, in memory. This dog wasn't just some K-9 unit from the local precinct. This was no ordinary rescue dog. She knew him. She had worked with him years ago back in the field. Ghost was a legend, a name whispered with reverence, a dog who had survived fire, explosions, gunfire, and the kind of pain most people couldn't even imagine. And if anyone could understand what he was doing right now, it was her. "Get me in there," Lara repeated, her voice firm. "I'm going after him." With a quick nod, her team began preparing the lines and safety gear, while Lara pressed forward, her every step slow, deliberate, as if the fire was already claiming her. The smoke twisted in thick clouds, choking her lungs, but she kept her eyes locked on the doorway, where Ghost remained unmoving. As she drew closer, the heat intensified, a blanket of suffocating warmth that made her skin burn. She could hear the crackling of the fire like the world's worst heartbeat. Then through the haze, she saw it, a child, no more than 6 or 7, with pale skin and eyes wide in terror, clutching a stuffed bear to her chest as she huddled in the corner near the back of the building. The girl's body trembled, her lips pale as she looked up at Ghost, who remained steadfast at the door. Lara's heart stopped for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. The girl was covered in soot, her hair tangled and dirty, but she was alive. Ghost was protecting her. Lara's gaze flickered to the dog, his fur matted with ash and sweat. His eyes locked on the child with an intensity that could break steel. Ghost wasn't just guarding her, he was waiting for something. For her, for help. And he wasn't going to leave, not until he was certain she was safe. Without hesitation, Lara rushed forward, her every move fueled by the gut-wrenching, desperate need to save them both. As she reached the child, Ghost slowly moved aside, his eyes still fixed on her, a silent assurance that he had done his part. Lara scooped the girl into her arms, her heart racing as the sound of the fire grew louder, closer. But it wasn't just the fire that sent shivers down her spine now. It was the weight of the girl in her arms, the unspoken history of Ghost's devotion. This wasn't just a dog doing his duty. This was a dog with scars, with memories of a past that haunted him. And this was his redemption. As the fire raged behind her, Lara's mind raced back through the years. She had seen Ghost when he was younger, when he was just a rookie K-9, a ferocious and loyal partner, always by her side. Now, standing on the edge of the fire with a child in her arms, Lara realized something. Ghost wasn't done. He hadn't been abandoned. He hadn't been left to fade into obscurity, not by her and not by the world. He had found his new mission, his new calling, and this was it. The heat burned hotter. The structure groaned, beginning to collapse behind them. But Ghost was already at Lara's side, leading the way, guiding her toward safety, guiding her toward redemption. They would get out of this together. He had never been alone, and neither would she. But the journey wasn't over yet. The sound of the fire snapping and popping behind them was almost deafening as Lara and Ghost, with the child still clutched in her arms, made their way through the smoke-choked hallway. The walls seemed to close in on them. Each step they took further into the labyrinth of collapsing beams and crumbling foundations. The heat was unbearable, but Lara's instincts, honed over years of working in dangerous situations, kept her focused. Her only goal was to get to the exit. The child, still trembling in her arms, whispered weakly, "Thank you for saving me." Her voice was hoarse, strained from the smoke, but there was something desperate in it, as though the words had been stuck inside her for too long. Lara nodded, her mouth dry. "You're going to be okay, kid, I promise." But the promise felt hollow as she heard the building groan again. And then from behind them came the ominous crack of wood splintering. Her heart jumped, and without a moment's hesitation, she turned and looked back. Ghost was still there, moving swiftly and deliberately, his eyes fixed ahead. He never flinched, never wavered. He was right there with her, protecting them both. Lara knew they couldn't wait much longer. The smoke was thickening, and the flames were creeping closer. She pushed forward, her every movement calculated. But the moment she turned another corner, something froze her in place. She couldn't see it at first through the haze, but there was a shadow in the distance, moving toward her. Another firefighter, perhaps, or another victim. But as the shadow cleared, Lara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a firefighter, it was Caleb Morrow, a man whose face she hadn't seen in over a decade, but whose eyes she would never forget. Caleb's uniform was singed, torn, as though he'd been through a war of his own. His gait was slow, unsteady, like he'd been walking for miles without rest. His face, once youthful and determined, now bore the weight of years. Years of battles fought in silence. Years of trauma that had carved lines deeper than any age could. He had the look of a man who had seen too much and survived too much, yet had never truly healed. Lara's heart twisted at the sight of him. Caleb wasn't just an old colleague. He had been her partner back in the field. Back when life was simpler, before the mission started going wrong, before they had both been broken in different ways. She hadn't seen him since the day he had walked away from the force, the day they'd both lost a part of themselves. And now here he was, standing in the middle of the wreckage of the fire, as if it were some cruel twist of fate that had led him here. He looked at her with tired eyes, but it wasn't recognition in them. It was something else, something heavy, something unresolved. "Lara!" His voice was rough, like sandpaper scraping across her soul. "What are you doing here?" I'm here to save this girl," Lara stammered, her voice trembling with the shock of seeing him after so long. "I'm getting her out. We don't have much time." Caleb's gaze flicked to the girl in Lara's arms, and for a brief moment, something almost resembling concern flickered in his eyes. Then his gaze shifted to Ghost, and Lara saw it. Saw how the dog's presence seemed to pull Caleb in like a magnetic force, the way the two of them shared that silent understanding. "You still working with him?" Caleb asked quietly, the hint of something painful lurking in his words. Lara nodded. "Always. He's not just a dog, Caleb. He's part of something bigger. Something that matters." Caleb's eyes softened, and for the briefest moment, Lara saw a crack in the armor he had built around himself. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced with something far darker. "I thought you'd moved on. I thought you'd left all this behind." Lara hesitated, the weight of his words sinking deep. But she didn't have time for this. She had a job to do. "Doesn't matter now. What's important is getting out of here. Together." But Caleb didn't move. His face remained unreadable, the emotional walls up as tightly as ever. He just stared at her, and then down at Ghost, his old partner, as if silently weighing his options. Before Lara could say another word, the building groaned again, louder this time. The floor beneath their feet trembled, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The fire had reached the building's core. Time was slipping through their fingers. "We need to move! Now!" Lara barked, urgency lacing her voice. Caleb hesitated. "I can't leave. There's someone else in here." Lara's heart stopped. "What? Who?" "Caleb, the whole building's coming down. We're not going to make it much longer." But Caleb's face remained set, his jaw clenched. "I can't leave without him. He's still in the back. We were supposed to be together. I won't leave him behind." The words hit Lara like a punch to the gut. She could hear the pain in Caleb's voice, the weight of the years that had led him here, the burden of a man whose soul had been crushed under the weight of responsibility and loss. Lara looked at Ghost. She saw how the dog was already moving, steady as always, his movements purposeful, as though understanding exactly what was at stake. The loyalty, the bond between Caleb and Ghost was undeniable, unspoken, but it was there. "Lara!" Caleb's voice broke her from her thoughts. "He's my brother in all the ways that matter." And then it clicked. Lara understood. She had always known that there was more to Caleb and Ghost than anyone could see from the outside. They had fought side by side, not just as partners, but as family. Their bond was something forged in blood, sweat, and the kind of trauma that only soldiers, human or not, could understand. It wasn't just the child they had to save, it was each other. Lara looked back at the building, the flames licking the sky like a dragon's breath. She glanced at Caleb again, his face etched with the kind of pain that didn't heal with time. The kind of pain that didn't go away, no matter how many years passed. "Let's go get him," Lara said, her voice quieter now, resolute. With Ghost leading the way, they pushed forward into the burning building, facing the heat, the smoke, the collapse together. They were a team again, and they would get out alive. The fire raged behind them, its ferocity a constant roar in the background. But the three of them, Lara, Caleb, and Ghost, moved as one, cutting through the smoke-filled hallways with a kind of quiet determination. The girl, still clutched in Lara's arms, seemed to have calmed, though her body still trembled from the ordeal. Ghost walked with a grace that defied the chaos around him, his one remaining leg steady, his eyes alert to every flicker in the air, every movement in the shadows. Lara's heart raced as they pushed deeper into the building, but there was a strange sense of purpose now. Something had shifted in Caleb. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands clenched at his side, in the way he moved with Ghost. Like the years of silence between them had evaporated in the heat of the moment. This was the Caleb she remembered, the one who had always fought to save others, even when it meant risking everything. But Lara knew that this time, it wasn't just the child they were saving. It was Caleb himself, maybe for the first time in a long while. And the bond between them, between Caleb and Ghost, had become the heart of their journey. Their shared past, the trauma, the losses, had led them here, to this moment. And now they had a chance to heal. But the fire was still burning, and time was running out. "Where is he?" Lara asked, her voice low but urgent. Caleb's gaze flickered to the floor, where the fire had already started to tear into the structural integrity of the building. He wiped a hand across his brow, and for a moment, his eyes softened, distant, remembering. "He's in the back, through the kitchen area," he said, his voice tight with something that was almost fear. Fear for a friend, fear for a partner. "His name's Charlie. He's been with me since the beginning. I couldn't leave him behind." Lara nodded, already moving. Ghost, without a word, veered off ahead of them, his keen sense guiding them through the darkened, smoke-choked labyrinth. He knew where to go. He had been here before, through every mission, every rescue. He understood loyalty in a way that no human could ever comprehend. They rounded a corner, and the stench of burnt wood and scorched fabric grew thicker. The heat intensified, each step more agonizing than the last. And then they reached the kitchen area. It wasn't much more than a shell now. What had once been a place of order and warmth was now a pit of destruction. The floor was buckling under the strain of the fire, and the walls seemed to be holding their breath before they collapsed entirely. Ghost paused at the door, his stance unshakable. He was waiting. Lara and Caleb moved in, their eyes scanning the debris for any sign of movement, any sign of life. The smoke was thick, but Caleb's eyes, those eyes that had seen too much, darted to the far corner, where a form lay still on the ground. "Charlie!" Caleb's voice broke through the heavy air, raw with emotion. But there was no response, no movement. Lara felt a pang in her chest, a gnawing sense of dread creeping in. But before she could take another step, Ghost darted ahead, slipping through the wreckage with an ease that only a K9 could achieve. He reached the corner and Lara saw him nudge a figure lying in the rubble. A man, his body covered in burns, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and soot. Charlie. For a moment, Lara couldn't breathe. She could hear the fire crackling behind them, the building groaning with every passing second. But all that mattered was Charlie. This man, this friend of Caleb's, was barely conscious. His body was scorched, a life saved only by the strength of his own will to survive. Caleb dropped to his knees beside him, his hands shaking as he reached for Charlie's face. "Charlie! Charlie, wake up! It's me! It's Caleb!" The man's eyelids fluttered, his lips moving, but no sound coming. Caleb's hands shook harder now, desperation creeping into his voice. "Charlie, please, please, you can't die here. Not like this." Lara stood back, the weight of the moment heavy on her heart. Ghost was still beside Charlie, his eyes watchful, his body low in a protective stance. He nudged the man again, this time more insistently, as though urging him to wake, to fight. It was then that Lara noticed the small tattered piece of cloth tied around Charlie's wrist. Something familiar, something she'd seen before. It was a military dog tag, the same kind of tag Caleb had worn years ago. A symbol of duty, of sacrifice, of all the things that these men, these dogs carried with them, no matter how far they ran from their past. Caleb's voice cracked as he spoke again, his breath shallow. "Charlie, you have to hold on. We're getting you out of here, together." The fire was closing in. Lara could feel it, the pressure mounting, the air growing thinner with every second they wasted. The heat was overwhelming. The room around them seemed to pulse with the ferocity of the flames, ready to devour them all. But Caleb wasn't leaving, and neither was Ghost. Lara moved toward Charlie's other side, her eyes on Caleb, who was now cradling the man in his arms, as though he were the most precious thing in the world. "We need to move him, Caleb. Now, we can't stay here." But Caleb didn't respond. His eyes were locked onto Charlie's face, his lips pressed tight together in a silent prayer. He wasn't just saving a man, he was saving a part of himself. "I can't leave him, Lara," Caleb said, his voice steady now. But the weight of his words hung in the air like a prayer he had said too many times before. "I won't. Not again." Lara could feel it then. The depth of Caleb's pain, the history between him and this man, this bond that no fire could burn away. And something in her shifted, something deep and knowing. She reached for Caleb's shoulder, squeezing it tightly. "Then we save him, together." For the first time in years, Caleb met her gaze, really met her gaze, and there was something in his eyes now. Something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of hope, a flicker of redemption. With a sudden burst of strength, Caleb lifted Charlie into his arms. Ghost moved to the front, leading them as he always had, the bond between man and dog as powerful as any force of nature. Together they would get out, together they would survive, and together they would find the way forward. The weight of Charlie in Caleb's arms was a reminder of everything he had carried over the years. Burdens, losses, things that no one should have to endure alone. His breath was shallow, sweat beading on his brow, but he didn't falter, not this time. He wasn't going to lose another one. Lara stayed close, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the roaring fire behind them. Ghost was just ahead, his movements precise, like he knew the exact path they needed to take, the quickest way to the exit. The heat continued to bear down on them, the air thick and acrid, and with each passing second, the building seemed to groan louder. It was a warning. Time was slipping through their fingers, and they had no guarantee that they'd make it out. Caleb's grip on Charlie tightened, his voice low but urgent. "Come on, buddy, just a little longer. We're almost there." Charlie's head lolled against Caleb's shoulder, but there was no response. His skin was cold, clammy, his breaths ragged and shallow. It was as though the fire had burned all the life out of him. And yet Caleb held him, like he had when they had both been younger, when Charlie had been the one to save Caleb in situations just like this. A protector, a brother. The bond between them was a language of its own, unspoken but undeniable. But Lara could see it, the toll it was taking on Caleb. His body was giving out under the weight, under the strain of carrying not just Charlie, but the years of guilt, regret, and unhealed scars that had driven him to this point. She had seen him push himself beyond limits before, but this was different. This was his past, his demons, weighing him down. "Caleb," she said softly, stepping closer. "We need to move faster. The smoke is getting worse." He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on Charlie's face, his jaw set in a grim line. But then, something flickered in his eyes, something that broke through the fog of his exhaustion. He nodded once, and with a final, strained effort, he stood straighter, holding Charlie with more resolve than he had before. And just like that, they were moving again. The building felt like it was holding its breath. And then, as if in response to their progress, the walls around them began to shake. Caleb's eyes widened as a loud crack echoed through the air. The ceiling above them began to buckle, beams falling with terrifying speed, splintering and crashing to the ground. Dust and ash swirled around them, thickening the air, making it almost impossible to see. Lara's pulse spiked, her heart hammering in her chest. "Caleb, we have to move, now!" They had reached the hallway near the exit when the first piece of debris fell in front of them. Ghost darted back, barking once, his warning sharp and urgent. Caleb's face twisted in pain, but his hands never loosened from Charlie. He could feel the weight of every second, every inch closer to that exit. But the fire was relentless, its hunger insatiable. Lara grabbed his arm, her voice firm with command. "We need to go. Ghost knows the way. Trust him." For a brief moment, Caleb hesitated, but then he looked down at Charlie, at the man who had saved his life so many times before, and in that instant, he understood. Ghost had led them before. He would lead them again. With a heavy sigh, Caleb nodded, and they moved forward together. The fire roared behind them, a monstrous force that seemed to grow angrier with every step they took, but they pushed forward. The exit was so close now, just beyond the last door that led out to safety. Caleb could see it in his mind, could feel it, but the building was fighting them every step of the way. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke blinding, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and metal. The walls around them seemed to close in, threatening to trap them in its fury. But then Ghost stopped. Lara, who had been focused on the exit, glanced at him. The dog was standing at the threshold of the door, his ears perked, his eyes wide and alert. He was staring at something behind them, something that Lara couldn't see. "Ghost?" Caleb's voice was a low growl, but Ghost didn't move. He stood his ground, a guardian once more. The sound of heavy footsteps reached their ears, distant at first, but then growing louder, closer. Someone else was coming. The flames had created a maze of destruction, and now the path they had taken was blocked by a wall of fire and debris. The exit that had been just steps away now seemed a lifetime off, the path cut off by the spreading blaze. Lara's heart dropped into her stomach. "We're trapped." The weight of Charlie in Caleb's arms was a reminder of everything he had carried over the years. Burdens, losses, things that no one should have to endure alone. His breath was shallow, sweat beading on his brow, but he didn't falter, not this time. He wasn't going to lose another one. Lara stayed close, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the roaring fire behind them. Ghost was just ahead, his movements precise, like he knew the exact path they needed to take, the quickest way to the exit. The heat continued to bear down on them, the air thick and acrid, and with each passing second, the building seemed to groan louder. It was a warning. Time was slipping through their fingers, and they had no guarantee that they'd make it out. Caleb's grip on Charlie tightened, his voice low but urgent. "Come on, buddy. Just a little longer. We're almost there." Charlie's head lolled against Caleb's shoulder, but there was no response. His skin was cold, clammy, his breaths ragged and shallow. It was as though the fire had burned all the life out of him. And yet Caleb held him, like he had when they had both been younger, when Charlie had been the one to save Caleb in situations just like this. A protector, a brother. The bond between them was a language of its own, unspoken but undeniable. But Lara could see it, the toll it was taking on Caleb. His body was giving out under the weight, under the strain of carrying not just Charlie, but the years of guilt, regret, and unhealed scars that had driven him to this point. She had seen him push himself beyond limits before, but this was different. This was his past, his demons, weighing him down. "Caleb," she said softly, stepping closer. "We need to move faster. The smoke is getting worse." He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on Charlie's face, his jaw set in a grim line. But then, something flickered in his eyes, something that broke through the fog of his exhaustion. He nodded once, and with a final, strained effort, he stood straighter, holding Charlie with more resolve than he had before. And just like that, they were moving again. The building felt like it was holding its breath. And then, as if in response to their progress, the walls around them began to shake. Caleb's eyes widened as a loud crack echoed through the air. The ceiling above them began to buckle, beams falling with terrifying speed, splintering and crashing to the ground. Dust and ash swirled around them, thickening the air, making it almost impossible to see. Lara's pulse spiked, her heart hammering in her chest. "Caleb, we have to move, now!" They had reached the hallway near the exit when the first piece of debris fell in front of them. Ghost darted back, barking once, his warning sharp and urgent. Caleb's face twisted in pain, but his hands never loosened from Charlie. He could feel the weight of every second, every inch closer to that exit. But the fire was relentless, its hunger insatiable. Lara grabbed his arm, her voice firm with command. "We need to go. Ghost knows the way. Trust him." For a brief moment, Caleb hesitated, but then he looked down at Charlie, at the man who had saved his life so many times before, and in that instant, he understood. Ghost had led them before. He would lead them again. With a heavy sigh, Caleb nodded, and they moved forward together. The fire roared behind them, a monstrous force that seemed to grow angrier with every step they took. But they pushed forward. The exit was so close now, just beyond the last door that led out to safety. Caleb could see it in his mind, could feel it, but the building was fighting them every step of the way. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke blinding, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and metal. The walls around them seemed to close in, threatening to trap them in its fury. But then Ghost stopped. Lara, who had been focused on the exit, glanced at him. The dog was standing at the threshold of the door, his ears perked, his eyes wide and alert. He was staring at something behind them, something that Lara couldn't see. "Ghost?" Caleb's voice was a low growl, but Ghost didn't move. He stood his ground, a guardian once more. The sound of heavy footsteps reached their ears, distant at first, but then growing louder, closer. Someone else was coming. The flames had created a maze of destruction, and now the path they had taken was blocked by a wall of fire and debris. The exit that had been just steps away now seemed a lifetime off, the path cut off by the spreading blaze. Lara's heart dropped into her stomach. "We're trapped." The roar of the fire behind them felt like a living thing, a beast that howled with frustration as it consumed everything in its path. Caleb's breath came in sharp gasps as he moved through the smoke, his legs heavy, his heart pounding with the weight of his choices. He was out of the building now, out of the inferno, but the world around him seemed to spin. His body felt like it was made of lead, but his mind raced with questions. Was Charlie going to be okay? Was Lara? Was he? He barely registered the fire captain's voice shouting orders as they reached the safety of the clearing outside the building. Fire trucks were lined up, hoses snaking across the ground, water pouring from them in great torrents to battle the raging fire. But all Caleb could see was the stark outline of the building, the skeletal frame of what used to be home to so many memories. He couldn't tear his eyes away. A hand gripped his arm, pulling him back into the present. "Caleb." Laura's voice was steady, but her grip on his arm was tight, like she knew, like she understood. She was here. She was safe. She was still holding on to him, keeping him anchored in this moment. His eyes flicked to hers, and in that moment, everything else faded. The fire, the smoke, the chaos. It was just the two of them. And Ghost. The dog had never left Caleb's side, his tail low but steady as he stood at attention, his eyes scanning the scene. Caleb's gaze softened as he crouched down to meet the dog's level, his fingers brushing against Ghost's fur, rough and still scarred from their years of service together. "Good boy," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. Ghost's gaze softened, and the dog leaned into him, nudging his shoulder with his head as if to say, "We made it." For a moment, Caleb simply knelt there, his hand on Ghost's neck, letting the quiet between them settle like a balm on a raw wound. There was no need for words. Ghost had always understood him without them. They were survivors, the two of them. They always had been. But it was then that a sound broke through the thick silence. The cough of a siren, the urgent murmur of voices. The firefighter who had been with them, Caleb's old captain, was already working with the paramedics, directing them toward Charlie. Caleb stood, his chest tight. He had to know. He had to know that Charlie was going to be okay. Laura's hand was still gripping his arm, pulling him toward the medics. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet force to her presence. She wasn't going to let him break. Not now. They reached the stretcher where Charlie lay, and for a moment, Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was pale, his chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. But there was a pulse, a rhythm to his breathing that wasn't there when they'd first found him. It was a fragile thread, but it was there. "He's alive," Caleb murmured, the weight of those words crashing down on him. "He's alive." The paramedic beside them nodded, but there was no sense of celebration in their eyes. Just quiet professionalism, the kind that Caleb had learned to recognize over years in the field. He wanted to ask how serious it was, but he couldn't. Not yet. Laura squeezed his arm again, and this time Caleb let out a shaky breath. He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, and for the first time in so long, he felt something like hope begin to grow in him. A fragile thing, but enough to light the way forward. They walked away from the paramedics, moving back to where the fire trucks were parked, where the fire had finally been tamed. The smoke still lingered in the air, the acrid scent of burning wood and metal still thick around them. But the fire itself, its unrelenting fury, had been held at bay. The storm had passed. "How did you know?" Lara asked, her voice quieter now, more curious than anything else. "How did you know we'd make it out?" Caleb's gaze flicked to Ghost, who had settled next to them, his eyes still watchful, still ever the protector. "I didn't," he said softly, "but I couldn't leave him behind. Not after everything we've been through." Lara nodded. "You and Ghost, you've both been through so much. You don't have to do this alone anymore, Caleb. You know that, right?" For a moment, Caleb didn't respond. He just looked at Lara, at the way her presence seemed to steady him, as though she too understood the weight of the years that had led him here. Ghost had been his partner, his brother, his lifeline. But maybe, just maybe, Lara could be something more, something new. "I know," Caleb finally said, his voice barely a whisper, but it was enough for now. They stood together, watching the fire, watching the aftermath of what had happened. But the one thing Caleb couldn't shake, the one thing that held him, was the sense that, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone anymore. The path forward was uncertain, but it was there. It always had been. And with Ghost beside him, with Lara at his side, maybe, just maybe they could start healing. Together. As the fire trucks began to pack up, as the smoke finally began to thin, Caleb glanced at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. The flames had taken so much, but it wasn't all gone. Not yet. There was still something worth fighting for. And for the first time, Caleb felt like he had a reason to fight again. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was something more. It was redemption. The night fell slowly over the town, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch as if the fire had never really left. The air was still thick with smoke, a hazy reminder of everything that had just happened. Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the aftermath. It felt surreal, the way everything had changed in just a matter of hours. But there was no denying it. The fire had stripped away so much, and yet somehow it had also given something back. Ghost sat beside him, silent and still, like the dog always had been in those moments of quiet understanding. Caleb ran his fingers through his hair, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't want to acknowledge. Lara had stayed close, watching him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through him, like she was waiting for him to say something. Anything. But Caleb didn't have the words. Not yet. They had rescued Charlie, but the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The paramedics had rushed Charlie to the hospital, the team working swiftly and efficiently to keep him alive long enough to get him the help he needed. Caleb had stayed with him for a while, his hand on Charlie's shoulder, his thoughts a jumbled mess. But eventually he'd let the medical team take over, trusting them to do what he couldn't. And now he was left with this emptiness, the feeling that no matter how many people were saved tonight, there was still something broken in him, something that had yet to heal. Caleb. Lara's voice broke through his thoughts. It was steady, but there was something in it that made him turn. She was standing a few paces behind him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. You don't have to carry it all alone. You don't have to do this by yourself. He didn't know how to answer her. His mind screamed at him to speak, to tell her what he felt, to let her in. But the words were tangled up inside him. For years, he had carried the weight of his own demons, and somehow it had become easier to shut people out than to face what was eating him alive. But Lara wasn't like the others. She had seen him, really seen him, and for some reason, that made it harder to hide behind the walls he'd built. She had gotten under his skin without even trying, and now she was standing there, offering something he wasn't sure he deserved. I don't know how, Caleb finally said, his voice rough, the words foreign in his mouth. I don't know how to let go of all of it, all the guilt, the regret. Lara stepped closer, her eyes soft but firm. You're not the only one carrying it, Caleb. You know that, right? For a long moment, Caleb didn't speak. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the weight she carried. The loss, the hurt, the things she kept hidden in the depths of her eyes. He wasn't the only one broken. She was too. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to fix each other. I don't know how to be what I used to be, he murmured, his voice barely audible in the cool night air. You're not supposed to be, Lara replied. None of us are. We're different now, Caleb, and that's okay. It's not about going back to who you were. It's about figuring out who you are now. Her words were simple, but they resonated with him in a way he couldn't explain. There was truth in them, raw, real truth that cut through the fog in his mind. It wasn't about going back to the man he had been, the man who had been so sure of himself, so confident in his purpose. That man was gone, but that didn't mean he couldn't find a new path, a new reason to keep going. He looked down at Ghost, the dog sitting loyally at his feet, the only one who had never questioned him. Ghost had always been there, through the darkest moments, through the battles he had fought, and the ones he hadn't won. Maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed. Someone to walk with him into whatever came next. I don't know what comes next, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm not doing it alone. Not anymore. Lara smiled then, a small, knowing smile, and for the first time, Caleb felt the weight of the world start to lift just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the night grew darker, the fire behind them slowly died down to embers, the smoke rising like the last remnants of a nightmare fading into the distance. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, and Caleb turned to see the captain, his face tired but relieved. Charlie's stable, the captain said, his voice low but firm. They've got him hooked up to all sorts of machines, but it looks like he's going to make it. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He's alive? The captain nodded. Yeah, for now, but it's going to be a long road, Morrow. Caleb's heart swelled with relief, the first real breath he had taken in what felt like years. Charlie wasn't out of the woods yet, but he had made it. He was still here, and that meant something. That meant there was still hope. "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice rough with gratitude. "Thank you for bringing him through." The captain's gaze softened. "It's what we do, Caleb, but you should know. Charlie wouldn't have made it if it wasn't for you. You got him out." Caleb swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without Ghost or Lara." The captain gave a knowing look. "I'm not sure there's anything you can't do with a team like that." As the words settled into the air, Caleb found himself smiling. Just a little. The future was uncertain. There would be challenges ahead, things they would have to face together, things they would have to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel like he was carrying everything on his own shoulders. There was strength in the people around him, in the bond they shared, and that was something that no fire could ever burn away. And in that moment, standing on the edge of the world he had known, and the one he was about to enter, Caleb realized that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance at redemption. Maybe this was what it meant to start over. And with Ghost at his side and Lara beside him, Caleb knew they would face whatever came next together. The days that followed felt like a blur, a quiet storm of recovery and quiet reflection. Caleb had always been a man of action, but now in the aftermath of the fire, there was a weight to stillness that was almost unbearable. He spent most of his time at the hospital, watching over Charlie as the man fought for his life. There was something surreal about it, watching someone who had once been his partner, his mentor, now lying in a hospital bed, unconscious and hooked up to machines. The fire had taken so much, but it hadn't taken Charlie. And for that, Caleb was grateful. Grateful in a way that felt raw and almost painful, as though each breath he took was a reminder of the cost of survival. Lara had kept her distance for the most part, letting Caleb do what he needed to do. But every so often she would appear at the hospital, her presence a steadying force. She never said much, but the way she looked at him, the quiet concern in her eyes, spoke volumes. She had already seen the kind of man he was, the man who didn't easily let go of his past. But she was patient. Patient in a way Caleb had never known anyone to be. It was as if she understood that the healing process was never a straight line. There would be fits and starts, moments of anger and despair, and moments of hope that flickered out just as quickly as they came. Still, with each passing day, Caleb found himself looking forward to her visits. She brought a kind of calm with her, a quiet certainty that he couldn't explain. She wasn't trying to fix him, not in the way that people often tried to fix broken things. She was just there, just present, and that somehow was enough. Caleb wasn't sure when it happened, when he began to open up to her, but it did. Slowly over time, he started to share things he hadn't spoken about in years. The memories of his time in the military, the loss of his family, the nights when the darkness would creep in and the silence would threaten to swallow him whole. The anger, the grief, the guilt, all the things he had buried deep inside for so long. And Lara listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply listened, her eyes steady on his, her presence a reminder that he wasn't as alone as he'd once thought. "I don't know how to move on from this," he told her one evening, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how to let go of the past. It feels like I'm suffocating under the weight of it." Lara didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, and for a moment, Caleb thought she might say something cliché, something about time healing all wounds or how it wasn't his fault. But she didn't. Instead, she gave him a simple, quiet answer. "You don't have to let go of everything, Caleb. Not all of it. Some of it. It becomes a part of you. It shapes who you are. You can carry it with you, but you don't have to let it control you." Her words hung in the air between them, simple but profound, and Caleb felt something inside him shift. Maybe she was right. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. Maybe it was about learning to live with it, to move forward despite it. It was a thought he'd never considered before. The idea that he didn't have to let go of the things that had shaped him, but instead, he could let them become part of the man he was becoming. A man who could still love, still care, still fight for what mattered. The thought was terrifying and liberating all at once. But even with that revelation, Caleb knew there were still battles to be fought. He wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. Charlie was still fighting for his life, and Caleb's heart twisted every time he thought about the man who had once been his brother in arms. The same man who had taught him everything he knew, who had stood by him through the darkest days of his career. Charlie was a fighter, no doubt, but there were no guarantees. Caleb couldn't afford to think about what would happen if Charlie didn't make it. He couldn't let himself fall apart again, not when there was so much still at stake. And then there was Ghost. The dog had been a constant presence at the hospital, always at Caleb's side, never far from his reach. He was more than a dog. He was a symbol of everything Caleb had fought for, everything he had survived. Ghost had never left his side, not once. He was a reminder that Caleb wasn't in this alone. He had a partner, a friend, someone who would never turn away from him, no matter how much he pushed them both away. Ghost had always been more than just a working dog. He was Caleb's anchor, the one thing that had kept him grounded through it all. And as Caleb sat in that sterile hospital room, staring at Charlie's unconscious form, he realized that Ghost had done for him what no one else could. He had saved him, more than once. Caleb reached down, his hand brushing against Ghost's fur, feeling the familiar warmth and steadiness beneath his fingers. The dog's ears perked up at the touch, and his gaze lifted to meet Caleb's, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. It wasn't just the bond of a soldier and his K9. It was the bond of two survivors, two souls who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. "You've been with me through it all, buddy," Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Ghost leaned in, nudging Caleb's shoulder with his head, as if to say, "I'll always be here." And for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt the weight of the past begin to lift, if only a little. It wasn't gone. It never would be. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to carry it with him, without letting it break him. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot, Caleb felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with obstacles. But for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. There were battles to be fought, but there were also victories to be won. And with Ghost by his side, and Lara's quiet strength to lean on, Caleb knew he wasn't walking into the future as a man broken by the past. He was walking into it as someone ready to rebuild, ready to fight, ready to live. And that was a beginning. The morning arrived with an uneasy calm. The sun, pale and distant, barely broke through the haze of clouds that lingered over the town. The fire was nothing more than a memory now, the charred remains of the building serving as a stark reminder of what had been lost. But the true battle was just beginning. It wasn't just the recovery of Charlie, or even the fire that threatened to consume the town. It was the battle Caleb fought within himself, the battle to confront the things he had buried for so long. As he walked down the hallway of the hospital, his boots echoing against the cold tiles, the weight of everything he had faced in the past week seemed to press down on him. Ghost trotted beside him, his pace steady and unwavering. The dog had become a constant in Caleb's life, a reminder of what it meant to keep moving, even when the world around him seemed to stop. Caleb's eyes lingered on the door to Charlie's room as he passed. The old man had been unconscious for days, hooked up to machines, fighting a battle that wasn't his to fight. But Caleb knew Charlie well enough to know that the man wasn't the type to give up easily. If anyone could pull through, it was Charlie. He reached the end of the hallway, and the quiet hum of the hospital's air conditioning filled the space around him. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint scent of flowers from the vases in the waiting rooms. Caleb's thoughts, however, were far from the scent of fresh roses. What would happen next? He had always been a man of action, of decisions made in the moment. But now, in the silence of the hospital, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for Charlie to wake. Wait for answers that seemed as far away as the stars. As he sat in the small waiting room, his fingers absently running over the rough surface of the old wooden table in front of him, Caleb found himself thinking about the things he had never really let himself consider. Things that were buried deep beneath the surface of his mind. Lara had been right about one thing. He didn't have to let go of everything. Some of it, all of it, had shaped him into the man he was now. The scars on his body and soul weren't marks of weakness. They were the proof of survival, proof that he had fought for something and that he had won, even if he couldn't always see the victory clearly. The door to the waiting room opened quietly, and Caleb's head snapped up. It was Lara, her face tired but determined. She had been there every day, not just for Charlie, but for him too. Her presence had become an anchor in the storm of his emotions, and he didn't know if he was ready to admit just how much that had meant to him. "How's he doing?" Caleb asked, his voice hoarse, though he wasn't sure why. He hadn't let himself feel this much in a long time, maybe too long. Lara's eyes softened as she stepped inside, the door clicking closed behind her. "He's stable for now. The doctors say it's a waiting game, but he's got the heart of a fighter. He's not giving up." Caleb nodded, his eyes distant. It was hard to hold on to hope when the truth was that they were all running on borrowed time. They weren't promised anything, not Charlie's survival, not his own peace of mind, not the redemption he had fought so hard for. "I keep thinking about everything we've been through," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. "The fire, the war, the loss. It feels like there's always something trying to pull me back, like I'm never going to get out of it." Lara sat down beside him, her eyes fixed on him, unwavering. "You don't get out of it, Caleb. You carry it, but you don't have to let it break you. You can make it part of who you are and who you're becoming." Her words, simple and true, hit him harder than he expected. He had been running from his past for so long, trying to escape the ghosts that haunted him. But what if running wasn't the answer? What if the only way to find peace was to stop running and face it all head on? "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Lara didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, the weight of her gaze on him, like she was seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space that allowed him to breathe, to think, to feel everything that had been building inside him for years. "You don't have to be," she finally said, her voice calm. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Caleb. You just have to be willing to try, to face the pain and not run from it." And that was it, the key to it all. Not strength, not power, not having it all together, but the willingness to try, to face the things that scared him, the things he couldn't control, and still keep moving forward. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe he just had to keep showing up. The door to the waiting room opened again, and this time, it was one of the doctors. Caleb stood quickly, his heart racing. "Mr. Morrow," the doctor said, looking directly at Caleb, "we've got some news about Charlie." Caleb's breath caught in his throat, and he exchanged a quick glance with Lara. For a moment, time seemed to stop. "Is he awake?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling with hope and fear. The doctor gave a small nod. "He's conscious. He's asking for you." Caleb's heart leapt in his chest, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Charlie was awake. He had made it. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but he was alive. And for Caleb, that was everything. "I'll be right there," Caleb said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He turned to Lara, his eyes intense. "Stay with me." Lara nodded, standing beside him. Together, they walked down the hallway toward Charlie's room, the weight of the last few days still heavy on their shoulders, but somehow more bearable. They had faced the worst, and now maybe, just maybe, they could face the future. The door to Charlie's room opened, and there he was, propped up in bed, his face pale but his eyes sharp. He looked at Caleb with a smile, weak but genuine. "You made it, old man," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "You made it." Charlie's smile widened. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere. Not without a fight." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Caleb laughed. It was a short, breathless sound, but it was real. A laugh that held the promise of something new, a new beginning, a new chapter, and the strength to face whatever came next. The fire had taken so much, but it had given something back too. The future wasn't certain, but one thing was clear. Caleb wasn't alone. The days that followed Charlie's awakening were a strange blend of hope and uncertainty. The road to recovery was long, and there were still plenty of sleepless nights, moments when the weight of what they'd all endured threatened to drag them back down. But for every setback, there was a step forward, small but significant. Caleb knew that healing wasn't a straight line. There would be days when it felt like they were moving backward, but there would also be moments when it felt like they were finally getting somewhere. Charlie was slowly regaining his strength, his body a battlefield of burns and bruises, but his spirit remained unbroken. The man who had once taught Caleb everything about survival, about fighting until your last breath, was now showing him something even more profound: how to rebuild after everything had been torn apart. The slow, steady progress was a testament to Charlie's resilience. Every day he sat up a little longer, smiled a little wider, and made jokes, though they were mostly about how badly the hospital food tasted. Even when the pain was unbearable, Charlie kept going, a living example of everything Caleb wanted to be. But there were still moments of doubt, shadows that lingered at the edge of Caleb's mind, like a storm waiting to break. What would happen when they left the hospital? When life outside the sterile walls of the ICU took hold again? Would they fall back into the darkness, or would they finally break free? Caleb's thoughts were interrupted one morning when Laura knocked on the door of his apartment, her face filled with a quiet urgency. "Caleb," she said, her voice tense, "we need to talk." He set down the cup of coffee he had been nursing and followed her outside. The morning was crisp, the kind of morning that made you feel like anything was possible. Yet Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was still, and the faint smell of smoke hung in the air, like a reminder of the fire that had almost consumed everything they held dear. Laura didn't speak immediately. She just stood there, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her eyes on the horizon. Caleb could see the lines of worry etched on her face. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he felt a knot form in his stomach. "There's something we need to address," she said, turning to face him. "Something I didn't know about. Something that's been hidden for a long time." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. The way she said it, the gravity in her voice. It was as if she was about to reveal something that could unravel everything they had fought for. His mind raced, running through every scenario, every possible secret that could come to light. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "It's about the fire," Laura said, her gaze unwavering. "It wasn't an accident, Caleb. The building, it was set, and not by some random arsonist. It's bigger than that." Caleb felt his stomach twist, the blood draining from his face as Laura's words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I've been doing some digging," Laura continued, her eyes hardening with determination. "There's evidence pointing to a pattern. Someone planned it, someone with connections to the town's high-ups. And I think it's connected to the very thing you're trying to outrun: the corruption. The people who've been pulling the strings for years." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, though it didn't make sense at first. Caleb had seen the devastation the fire had caused, the lives lost, the families torn apart. But to hear that it was deliberate, that someone had orchestrated it, sent a chill through his spine. "Are you saying this was all set up? That they did this on purpose?" Caleb's mind raced. The thought of it was almost too much to bear. Laura nodded, her expression grim. "Yes, the fire, it was meant to send a message, to burn down everything, to make people afraid. But it's not just the fire that's the problem, it's who's behind it." Caleb's pulse quickened as his mind flicked through the names of people in the town, the ones who had been around when everything had fallen apart. It wasn't just the fire. There was something deeper, something darker at play. And Caleb had no doubt that whoever was behind it was trying to silence him, and everyone else who had been too close to the truth. "This is bigger than I thought," Caleb said, his voice strained. "We have to expose them. Whatever it takes, Laura. We can't let them get away with this." Laura's eyes softened, but there was no hesitation in her stance. "I've already started pulling the threads. I don't know who's involved yet, but I'm going to find out. We'll take this down together." The air around them seemed to hum with urgency, the morning light now casting long shadows across the empty street. Caleb could feel the weight of the mission settling over him once more, but it wasn't the crushing burden it had once been. This time, he wasn't alone. He had Lara, he had Charlie, and most importantly, he had Ghost, his unwavering companion, the one who had saved him when everything else was falling apart. Ghost appeared at Caleb's side, his ears perked up, his eyes sharp and alert, as if he too knew something was coming. Caleb knelt down, his hand brushing against the dog's fur, finding comfort in the familiar presence. "You're with me on this, buddy?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Ghost responded with a soft nudge, his tail wagging just once, a small but powerful gesture of loyalty. The bond they shared was undeniable. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a purpose. "We'll take them down," Caleb said, his voice steady. "We'll expose the truth." As Lara turned and began to walk away, her steps purposeful, Caleb stood with Ghost at his side, ready for whatever came next. He had been broken, but he had been rebuilt, piece by piece, through the pain, the loss, and the struggle. And now he wasn't just fighting for his own redemption, he was fighting for the truth, for justice, for everything that had been stolen from them. The battle was far from over, but Caleb Morrow was ready. And this time, he wasn't going to let anyone win. Not without a fight. The storm was coming. It wasn't the kind of storm that could be seen on a weather forecast. No radar to predict it, no warning signals or sirens to prepare for it. This storm was different. It was the kind that came from within, born from the darkest corners of a town that had long ignored its own secrets. The kind of storm that brewed when the truth was too dangerous to stay hidden any longer. Caleb had always known there was something wrong in Fern Hollow. The fire, the sudden disappearance of people, the whispered rumors of corruption. But the truth, this truth, was something he had never expected. And now, standing on the edge of it all, he could feel the weight of it pressing in on him, threatening to break everything wide open. Lara had gathered what she could, a trail of evidence that led them to the heart of the conspiracy. As they sifted through documents, videos, and photos, the pieces slowly came together. It wasn't just about the fire, it was about a network. Powerful people who had been using Fern Hollow for years, manipulating the town like pawns on a chessboard. The fire had been a warning, a way to remind everyone who was in charge. But that was about to change. They had their final piece of the puzzle, the last link in the chain, the one person whose involvement had remained hidden, even as the town's fabric began to unravel. Someone Caleb never would have suspected. The mayor, the man who had promised safety, progress, and growth. The man who had made Fern Hollow his home. The man who had been shaking hands with those who caused the fires, covering up the abuse, the disappearances, all in the name of power. The sun had set, and the darkness was thick with tension. Caleb stood outside the mayor's mansion, the flickering light from the street lamp casting long shadows over the yard. Ghost was at his side, ever alert, his muscles tense, as if he knew that tonight would be the moment they had been preparing for. Lara's voice crackled through the earpiece, steady but full of purpose. "We're in position, ready when you are." "Stay close," Caleb muttered under his breath, though he knew she was already where she needed to be. His heart hammered in his chest as he reached for the door, the weight of the mission heavy on his shoulders. But this time, it wasn't just about the fire, the injuries, or the scars. It was about everything that had been stolen from them, the community, the truth, their dignity, and about making sure that nothing like this could ever happen again. He glanced down at Ghost, the dog's steady eyes meeting his. The loyalty in those eyes was a reminder of how far they had come, how much they had fought through, and how much they still had to protect. Caleb took a deep breath, his hand gripping the handle of the door. Tonight it would end, one way or another. The door creaked open, and they stepped into the shadowed hall. The mansion was eerily quiet, a place that should have felt safe, but instead felt like a tomb. Caleb's mind raced with all that had led them here. His time in the military, his return to Fern Hollow, the fire, the betrayals. He had wondered for so long if he was strong enough to face what was coming. But standing here now with everything he had lost and everything he had gained, he knew that he was ready. They made their way through the darkened house, every floorboard creaking underfoot, every turn fraught with danger. The silence was suffocating. The only sound the steady rhythm of their breaths and the faint scratching of ghost claws on the wooden floor. Then they found him, the mayor standing in the middle of his grand office, staring out the window as if he had no idea the storm was about to break. Caleb's hands tightened around the gun at his side, not in anger, but in a deep, unsettling calm. He wasn't here to fight, not like this. But justice? That was another matter. The mayor turned, surprised but not shocked, his eyes narrowing. "Morrow," he said, his voice cool, dismissive. "I should have known you'd find your way here. I underestimated you." "You made a mistake," Caleb said quietly, his voice low but cutting. "You thought you could hide behind your lies, behind the power. But you're wrong. The truth is coming for you. It's already here." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the room, like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Caleb felt the anger rising in his chest, but it wasn't the anger of someone seeking revenge. It was the anger of someone who had watched too much darkness go unchecked, who had seen too many lives ruined by those who thought they were untouchable. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," the mayor said, his voice finally betraying a hint of unease. "This town, everything you see here, it's built on things you'll never understand. The people you're trying to protect are weak. They don't deserve to know the truth." Caleb took a step forward, Ghost at his side, his eyes never leaving the mayor's. "It's not about what you think they deserve. It's about what they need. And what this town needs is justice. Not lies, not manipulation. Justice." The mayor took a step back, his gaze flicking to the door as if contemplating his escape. But he knew deep down that there was no way out. The truth had already been revealed. The evidence was undeniable. "You can't stop what's coming," Caleb said, his voice unwavering. The mayor's eyes darkened, and in that moment, Caleb saw the true nature of the man. The mask of power had slipped, revealing the fear beneath. But it wasn't fear of being caught. It was fear of losing control. Fear of the people finally seeing the truth. But Caleb wasn't afraid. The door opened suddenly and Lara stepped into the room, her presence a steadying force. Behind her were several officers, their eyes sharp, their hands ready. The mayor's smug expression faltered, and Caleb could see the defeat in his eyes. "Your game is over," Lara said, her voice calm but resolute. The mayor tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, his mouth dry. There was no more power to be had, no more control to cling to. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing that, no matter how dark it gets, the truth will always find its way into the light. That no matter how hard the fight, redemption is possible. The mayor was taken away, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him with every step. And as the officers led him out, Caleb stood in the room, feeling the quiet surge of victory, of justice finally served. He turned to Ghost, his loyal companion, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of peace. They had done it. Together they had faced the storm, and they had come through it stronger. The town was safe again, the truth out in the open, and Caleb finally was free. Not from the past, but from the fear that had always held him back. And as he walked out into the night, the stars above shining bright, Caleb knew that the journey wasn't over. But the road ahead was clearer than it had ever been. And for the first time in a long time, he had hope. Hope for a future built on truth, on loyalty, and on the strength of those who refuse to be broken. This was just the beginning. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like, share, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more powerful emotional stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. There's so much more to come.